I am going to say a lot of what I feel at this point about technology. I've had a bit of a day where it's like I've been learning the answers to questions like why the fuck does running an instance of Firefox require, this much RAM usage, at the end of the day, and this isn't just this thing, it's a bunch of different processes all dovetailed together running in the background on it. So that's using an metric fuck ton of RAM all together, and answering these questions, and coming to the realization and learning that why this is it happens to be the case is you know a bit of a horror story, altogether in it, which is to say that the way that Firefox is constructed and the way that Chrome is constructed is set up in such a way so that if any website induces a crash to your system, it doesn't end up crashing the whole browser or the whole operating system and taking it down with you. And this is obvious stabilization benefits and everything, but the whole problem with it is essentially what it does is it turns your Firefox instances into just a complete memory hog. And then it's the same with Chrome. There's no getting away from this. This is just how it is at this point, and it uses just an absolute assload of RAM. You look at which programs are running the most and heavy processes, and for the most part, at this point, it's not. Before I started trimming like the programs and using the process lasso to prevent search hosts from rebooting and everything, it was the start menu, programs that Windows was running to get all that other crap and garbage up on it. And I've obviously used a few hacks here to bring things into this state with OpenShell, and everything. And why do this? Because it cuts down on RAM usage significantly. All this shit running in the background, now I've freed up a huge amount of memory by doing things in this fashion as opposed to the way that it was doing it before. But the whole problem is that a modern web browser is sandboxed like crazy, so every individual tab that you have running and open in Firefox will essentially run as its own separate process on the system that you're on your desktop, or or your laptop. And that's a really major problem, because of the fact that it ends up using a bunch of RAM. And I mean, yes, it stabilizes things, but the web is already a bloated mess of inefficiency that runs on JavaScript, and these JavaScript programs pull in tons and tons and tons of stuff just to support it, because the language, by default is so unfeatured that it has to pull in a bunch of dependencies to do what it does. And they're pulled in, and they're cobbled together all over the place. And if any single one of them is updated at all, the developers have to go in and rewrite their websites to make it compatible with what's going on. But the obvious disadvantages of all of this, and this problem here and on our systems, is that our web browser ends up eating in a ton of memory. And I have I might run on my system, and I'm gonna turn things off for just a sec because I don't want you to see my file folders. But I'm obviously going into the Torzu folders. God damn it, I'm trying to avoid. Right. No. Very recently, I used Torzu to play a particular game, and you're seeing that the cheat menus are enabled because I had some trouble towards like the very end of the game, which means I probably have to go back and play it again and everything just to experience the combat without all of this stuff, and go through. I just wasn't I didn't have the things that I needed to beat the Godfrey fight and everything, and so I don't want these enabled or anything at this point. If I go back through, I don't want anything really enabled at all. I want to play the game for real, but yeah, I was using a bit of hacking of the whole thing at the time, but I had trouble with it. But that wasn't really what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the fact that if I'm running this, I don't want to have to deal with you know Firefox costing this much goddamn RAM. I mean, you just load it up, and I mean, this is just insane what it goes through, and we can see it on the Process Explorer once it's booted. We can get and see transparent information about the executable that is now running on my system, and it's going to eat a ton of RAM, and so it's like and that's not just one instance. It's now there where it's eating basically nearly 450 of RAM, 450K of RAM, and that's just crazy. And then of course you have up here another executable which is running so you're going up to a gig, and then you have one down here as well, and then you have this one as well, and this one as well, and this one as well, and so this all adds up to a lot of RAM being utilized by Firefox. And if I, even at 16 gigs, some of these games that are being emulated can be quite demanding in terms of memory, right? So if I'm running it and I want to be social, and I want to be talking to my people and my friends that are only accessible via something like Facebook and Blue Sky, and seeing what they're up to and what they're posting, I can't do that. Or effectively, if I try to do that, it might make my game more unstable or slower, or anything else, because it's also competing for the same resources. And that trade-off means that tab discipline needs to be basically at this point closing all of it down and maybe running a single tab just to look up things for the game. And I don't want to run that way. I want to be able to run a bunch of processes at once while I'm playing it. And this has got me to the point where I've realized that if I, as a user, wanted software and what I wanted from the developers at this point, and the kinds of software that I want to see in the world, is shit like this. Hold on. Let me pull it up in the search menu. Oh wait, I've disabled the search host, so let me go back in and load it up myself. And of course they don't. Oh, right, there it is. Z library. I want you to notice something about that. That isn't happening in the browser at all. It's interacting with a page, and yet here, let's see what it is in the terms of memory that it's utilizing for this. Not a whole lot comparatively. It's a lot more efficient to do things this way, completely unchained from the web browser, because this doesn't need to be sandboxed to anywhere near the same extent as a consequence of this. And this is great. This is so much better than it was, as a consequence of being completely unchained from the web browser, because it doesn't have to sandbox things. It doesn't have to rely on JavaScript to anything near the same extent. It doesn't have to be utilized by these fucking memory hogs of applications. And so it's like, what I want to see is more applications that are exclusive to the desktop, they may connect to the internet, but they don't rely on a web browser at all. You know, much the same way that I might run an instance of Ubuntu in order to run, IRSI. It's a web app. It's not, well, it's not a web app, but it's an internet program that just doesn't rely on the World Wide Web. Oh yeah, sorry. Again, I'm going through and trying to do things when I don't have my search host because it uses too much fucking RAM. So let's try to get into our instance of Ubuntu, and start that up. Then, maybe I should pin it to the goddamn. Of course I can't. So, I'll boot into RSI. And yeah, it's obviously configured. Schedule a ship and fleet. I decided to learn how to use it. So when I look in the window list, window go to 4. Now I'm not sure I really like that approach of having to switch to tab between windows in that fashion, but I suppose I could program some hotkeys for the channels that I want to swap to, and I'll, probably as a result and consequence of doing that, I'll become much more proficient, because it can keep it on the keyboard and not have to pick up the mouse in order to do that and to tab between them. So it's actually a lot quicker to do things in that fashion. But you see that how that happens, and that I'm running IRSI, and I haven't fully configured it the way that I want it, but I've done some work to configure it to connect to the things that I want to connect to. And these are much better applications because they're not very resource intensive. They don't use a lot of RAM at the end of the day. They're not very demanding, but of course, running the whole VM in the background is not great in terms of RAM, But let's see. I'm trying to figure it out because I'm not entirely sure which oh, so it would be the WSL service. Yeah, see. So that's not anywhere near as bad as I thought it would be. The Windows subsystem for Linux, like, wow, that is not, well, yeah, but it's still a lot better, than I would have thought it would have been, on the Windows subsystem for Linux. That's actually not that bad in order to run that. So, that's really great. And, seeing all this and seeing the way that browsers had to be designed this way in order to stabilize them and prevent a single application's instability from crashing your whole browser, and maybe the whole system while I was with it. There are obviously trade-offs for it, but at the end of the day, it ends up costing a bunch of RAM, and that means that for me, it's like it was already bad enough that Chrome is a scripting language that is 16 times as less quick than Rust as a programming language, but then you have on top of this isolation of each and every one of your tabs as completely separate processes from all the other tabs. And so when and it's done this way because this way, essentially stabilizes the browser and makes it, less likely to crash, out. Like, how do I taskbar settings, like, how do I disable the search box, because of the fact that I don't have that anymore. The search host, Alright, good, now it's disabled. And you can't see it because it's too low on the screen for that, to be shared with you, but, I don't know how to... Is there a way to... No, there really isn't. So yeah, no. But I've killed off effectively the old, the crappy style of start menu on Windows. I've gotten rid of that. I've gotten rid of the search host because it was too RAM intensive to be, to have search functionality, on my computer, and I basically know where most things are. I've set it up in that kind of way where I don't have to go on a big rabbit hole search for most things, and yeah, just keeping this and being able to see all this is great. It's pretty great, that I've hacked this whole thing, but this was basically done as an optimization hack. All of it was done to kill off, the way that Windows had that damn web view shit that it was using in order to, to keep updating the news on the damn thing, when really I have to get away from using the browser to use RSS. I got to start putting that together in this program too, and so I can use, you know, essentially my copy of the Windows subservice for Linux, in order to, or just an SSH into the MacBook to use Newsboat in particular, because Newsboat is really great. Newsboat is, oh no, it wants to run a PowerShell instance and very great, very nice, so and the great part about this is that it's not resource intensive. As I read it, into it, it's not very demanding on my system. It's not heavy. It doesn't utilize a lot of resources to do things this way at all. It's not a big use of anything, and closing out of Firefox and getting out of that, conserves resources, and I can hear my computer's fans, and I can hear the way that they get less intensive when I close programs like that. That sort of thing is a thing for me, and it's started to drive me absolutely insane. See, I'm using the process lasso here to just completely render Windows unable to start up the search host. Like, I'm done. I don't want it, because it was too big of a use of RAM. It was like 400 meg, that I can just free up in that kind of way and not have to deal with that crap, and have it running in the background constantly. And yeah, this is pretty great in this state without Firefox open at all on the system. But of course, at some point I'm going to have to open it up and do things in Firefox, which I don't like having to do. And so it's like, dear developers, can we start moving more programs away from the browser, and back onto the desktop? Because in the world of desktop, you don't need that kind of, I guess you could say, like, every individual website doesn't have to have isolation from each other, at that point, like, you don't have, besides which, I guess you could say that if all these websites released applications of their own, to access them, you would not need to use a browser that has to be sandboxed from each other. And I suppose the only upside is that you get all those fucking extensions, but everything has become so fucking intensive in terms of RAM utilization, and it's like I have to make a trade-off when I play a game like this. I can't be having all that, a bunch of fucking Firefox tabs open at the same time as playing this. I'm gonna be left with one or two, just to look things up. But I can't be monitoring what everybody is doing unless it's on something like my phone, you know. And I'm starting to go absolutely crazy at the state of things and the state of all of it. You know, like I know why things are this way. I just hate the way that they are. Like I don't like this. I want a solution to it. I want something that wouldn't be such a massive, utilization of RAM in order to do it. I want something that leaves more of my RAM free for other things other than, having to do, to be devoted to the browsers that are almost as large as the fucking Linux kernel. It's just insane. It's crazy that things are in this state to me. It's crazy that this is the way that it is, and it's crazy that we've allowed things to get to this point, and the reasons that we've gotten to this point are, they make sense to me, but they're not great. They're not, the trade-off just isn't worth it ultimately. It's much better, like I said, to access Z library this way than the other way. You know, because this doesn't use so many resources to do. It's not resource intensive. I don't have to go through their website and load a private one whole instance of Firefox to do it. And it seems to me that it would be pretty great to move away from the fucking web, the World Wide Web, accessible on it. And sure, that means if you want people to be able to access it from their phone, they're going to have an app for that for the phone. But I don't give a rat's ass. Do you hear me? I don't care. I don't like JavaScript. I don't like the fact that everything is sandboxed from each other, and it uses so much goddamn RAM. That's what I care about.